The evening rush at Bellini's had just begun when Sophie Chen tied her apron around her waist and tucked a few stray hairs behind her ear. She'd been on her feet for nearly 8 hours already, having picked up an early lunch shift to cover for Danny, who had caught the flu that was making its way through half the staff. Sophie's lower back ached and her feet were beginning to protest inside her sensible black shoes. But she pushed the discomfort aside. The dinner shift meant better tips, and better tips meant she could put a little more aside for her grandmother's medication. Table 7 needs water, and 12 is getting impatient about their appetizers, said Rick, one of the other servers, as he rushed past with a tray of martinis balanced expertly on one palm. Sophie nodded and grabbed a pitcher of ice water. The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. Bellini's was one of those New York establishments that wasn't quite famous enough to be impossible to get into, but expensive enough that people dressed up and expected to be impressed. The lighting was kept dim, the decor tastefully minimal, and the menu was small but curated. Sophie had worked there for almost 2 years now, and she still couldn't afford to eat there on her own dime. She approached table 7, where a group of 6 people sat laughing loudly. One man at the center seemed to be holding court, his voice carrying above the others. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Sophie's monthly rent, and his watch gleamed under the soft lighting. The others around him leaned in when he spoke, laughing a beat too enthusiastically at his jokes. Sophie recognized the dynamic immediately, the big boss and his eager-to-please employees or associates. "Good evening," Sophie said warmly, approaching with her water pitcher. "Welcome to Bellini's." The man in the center barely glanced at her as she began filling water glasses. "And then I told him, either double the investment or get out of my office. You should have seen his face." The table erupted in laughter again. Sophie moved carefully around the table, making sure each glass was filled 3/4 full, just as Mr. Veluti, the owner, insisted. As she reached across to fill the last glass, a woman at the table shifted suddenly to show something on her phone to another guest. Her elbow knocked into Sophie's arm, sending a splash of ice water across the table and onto the lap of the man in the navy suit. "Oh," Sophie gasped. "I'm so sorry, sir." The man jumped up, his face darkening as he looked down at the wet spot on his pants. "What the hell?" "It was an accident," Sophie said quickly, already pulling napkins from her apron. "Let me help." "Don't touch me," he snapped, snatching the napkins from her hand. The table had gone quiet, the earlier joviality evaporating. Sophie felt her cheeks burning. "I'm very sorry, sir. The water should dry quickly, but we can offer to have your suit cleaned if—" "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" He interrupted, dabbing at his pants with obvious disgust. "Probably more than you make in 3 months." The woman whose elbow had caused the accident looked down at her plate, saying nothing. "Blake, it's just water," said another man at the table. Though his voice was tentative, Blake ignored him, his gaze fixed on Sophie. "Are you new here or just incompetent?" Sophie felt a knot forming in her throat but kept her voice steady. "Neither, sir. It was an accident, and I apologize." "An accident," Blake repeated, his tone mocking. He looked around at his companions. "Hear that? It's an accident when you can't even pour water without making a mess." He turned back to Sophie. "What's your name?" Sophie hesitated. She needed this job. She couldn't afford to get fired over a customer complaint. Not with her grandmother's medications and her own school applications to pay for. "Sophie," she said quietly. "Well, Sophie, maybe serving water is too complicated for you. Maybe you should try something simpler. Do they let you mop floors here, or is that too challenging as well?" A few uncomfortable chuckles came from the table. Sophie noticed the woman who'd bumped her arm take a large sip of wine. Her eyes averted. "I'll get you some more napkins," Sophie said, struggling to maintain her composure. As she turned to walk away, Blake called after her, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Actually, I'd prefer a different server. Someone who didn't fail basic motor skills." Sophie's steps faltered, but she kept walking toward the kitchen. She could feel the stares of the other diners boring into her back. Inside the kitchen, she leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. "Everything okay?" asked May, one of the line cooks, glancing up from the dish she was plating. "Fine," Sophie said automatically. "Just a difficult table." She grabbed a stack of napkins and headed back out, only to see Mr. Veluti, the owner, already at table 7, all smiles and apologies. He caught Sophie's eye and gestured for her to come over. "Ah, here she is," Mr. Velluti said, his Italian accent thickening as it always did when he was trying to charm difficult customers. "Sophie, Mr. Harrington has had a little accident with some water." "Yes. I was just getting extra napkins," Sophie said. Holding them out, Blake Harrington, so that was his name, looked at her with cold eyes. "I was just explaining to your boss that I'd prefer a different server for the evening." Mr. Velluti's smile didn't waver, but Sophie saw the warning in his eyes. Blake Harrington was clearly someone important, someone whose satisfaction mattered more than a waitress's dignity. "Of course, Mr. Harrington. Jason will be taking care of your table for the remainder of your evening. Sophie, please assist table 15 instead." "Yes, sir," Sophie said, handing the napkins to Mr. Velluti and turning away. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she heard Blake's voice again. "It's not just the spill. Did you see how she was hovering? Like she was trying to eavesdrop on our conversation?" "Some people just don't understand proper service," Mr. Velluti replied smoothly. "I assure you, Jason is one of our best." The rest of Sophie's shift passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical movements. She took orders, delivered food, and refilled glasses with robotic precision, all while avoiding looking in the direction of Blake Harrington's table. But she could feel his presence, his laughter occasionally rising above the restaurant's ambient noise, reminding her of her humiliation. During a brief lull, Sophie slipped into the employee bathroom and checked her phone. There was a text from Mrs. Liu, their elderly neighbor who stayed with Sophie's grandmother during her shifts. "Grandmother took medicine and is sleeping now. Don't worry, all okay. You bring home soup?" Sophie texted back a quick yes, promising to bring home some of the restaurant's soup that would otherwise be thrown out at closing. Mrs. Liu was kind enough to help with grandmother for much less than a professional caregiver would charge, but Sophie knew the arrangement couldn't last forever. Her grandmother's Parkinson's was getting worse, and soon she would need more specialized care. That was why the piano was so important. If Sophie could get accepted to a conservatory with a scholarship, she could eventually find better-paying work as a musician or teacher. She had the talent, her teachers had always told her so. But talent wasn't enough without opportunity, and opportunity seemed to be the one thing life consistently denied her. As her shift neared its end, Sophie saw Blake Harrington and his group getting ready to leave. They were louder now, clearly having enjoyed plenty of Bellini's overpriced wine. Jason, who had taken over their table, was all smiles as he handed Blake the check. Sophie busied herself clearing a nearby table, keeping her back to them. But as the group stood to leave, Blake's voice carried across the restaurant. Again. And then she tried to blame it on someone else bumping. Her, classic. People like that never take responsibility. Sophie's hands tightened around the plates she was stacking. That wasn't true. She hadn't blamed anyone. But it was her word against his, and in places like Bellini's, people like Blake Harrington always got the benefit of the doubt. As they passed by, Sophie kept her head down. But Blake paused, noticing her. "Oh, look, it's our little water girl," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Still managing to keep things dry?" His companions laughed, though a couple looked uncomfortable. One woman tugged at his arm. "Blake, come on, the car's waiting." Blake allowed himself to be pulled toward the exit, but not before adding, "You know, some people just aren't cut out for certain jobs. No shame in knowing your limits." After they left, Sophie finished clearing her tables in silence, her face burning with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. When her shift finally ended at 11 p.m., Mr. Velluti called her into his small office. "Sophie," he began, folding his hands on his desk, "about what happened earlier." Sophie braced herself for a reprimand or worse. "That was Blake Harrington," Mr. Velluti continued. "Do you know who he is?" Sophie shook her head. "Tech millionaire. Made his fortune with some app that sells people's data or something." Mr. Velluti waved his hand dismissively. "Not important. What's important is that he comes here with business associates and they spend a lot of money." "I understand," Sophie said quietly. "It won't happen again." Mr. Velluti studied her face. "You're a good worker, Sophie, reliable. But in this business, the customer is always right, especially when the customer can buy and sell this entire block without blinking." "Yes. Sir, take tomorrow off. Jason will cover your lunch shift." Sophie's heart sank. She needed those hours, those tips. "It's not a punishment," Mr. Velluti added, perhaps seeing her expression. "Just a cooling-off period." Harrington said he might be back with clients next week. Better if you're not on the schedule then. Sophie nodded, knowing there was no point in arguing. Thank you for understanding, Mr. Veluti. As she left the restaurant with a container of leftover minestrone soup for her grandmother, Sophie felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders. One accident, one spilled glass of water, and she'd lost a day's wages. One entitled rich man's ego, and her already precarious financial situation was that much more unstable. She boarded the subway, finding a seat in the nearly empty car. At this hour, it was mostly late-shift workers like her, heading home to the outer boroughs where rent was slightly more affordable. Sophie leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes, mentally calculating how this would affect her savings. She was already behind on her application fee for the Manhattan School of Music. Another month delayed, maybe 2. As the subway rattled through the tunnels beneath the city, Sophie allowed herself a moment of self-pity. Then she straightened up, pulled out her phone, and began reviewing a piano piece she'd been practicing, her fingers moving silently over imaginary keys. Blake Harrington might see a clumsy waitress when he looked at her, but he had no idea who she really was or what she was capable of. One day, she promised herself, people would see her differently. One day, they would have to listen. Sophie unlocked the door to the small 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her grandmother, trying to be as quiet as possible. It was nearly midnight, and she didn't want to wake her if she was sleeping. The apartment was in a pre-war building in Flushing, Queens, with creaky floors and radiators that clanked through the winter months. But it was home, and the rent was still manageable, even if it took most of Sophie's income. "Nai-Nai, are you awake?" Sophie called softly, using the Chinese word for grandmother. A light was on in the living room. Her grandmother, Lin Chen, sat in her favorite armchair with a book open on her lap. At 72, Lin still had a straight back and alert eyes, though her hands now trembled constantly, a symptom of the Parkinson's that had been diagnosed 3 years ago. "Ah, Sophie, you're back." Lin smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "How was work today?" Sophie set down her bag and the container of soup on the coffee table. "It was fine. The usual." She didn't want to burden her grandmother with the story of her humiliation. Lynn studied her granddaughter's face carefully. "Your eyes say different." Sophie sighed and sat on the worn sofa across from her grandmother. They had always been able to read each other well. After Sophie's parents had died in a car accident when she was 12, Lynn had raised her alone, moving from Beijing to join her in New York, where Sophie had been born during her parents' brief time studying in America. "Just a difficult customer," Sophie admitted. "He got water spilled on him and made a big scene. Mr. Veluti gave me tomorrow off." "Gave you off?" Lynn frowned. "You mean no pay?" "It's just one shift," Sophie said, trying to sound unconcerned. "I'll practice piano instead." Lynn's face softened at the mention of piano. Music had been her life before Parkinson's made playing impossible. She had been a respected piano teacher at a conservatory in Beijing, and she'd taught Sophie from the age of 4. "Good. Your audition is coming soon, yes?" Sophie nodded.
6 weeks.
"But I'm still saving for the application fee." "Use the emergency money," Lynn suggested, not for the first time. "That's for your medication," Sophie replied firmly. "Don't worry. I'll figure it out." She helped her grandmother to bed, making sure her pills for the morning were set out, then went to the kitchen to heat up some of the soup for herself. As she ate at their small table, Sophie pulled out her phone and checked her bank balance. The numbers stared back at her, stubbornly unchanged. Even with her double shifts, she was barely keeping up with rent, groceries, and her grandmother's medical expenses. The application fee for the Manhattan School of Music was $110. Then there would be audition expenses, and if by some miracle she got in, tuition would be another mountain to climb. After washing her bowl, Sophie went to the corner of the living room where her keyboard stood. It wasn't a proper piano, just a weighted 88-key digital keyboard she'd bought secondhand 3 years ago. But it had decent touch sensitivity and a headphone jack, which meant she could practice at night without disturbing the neighbors. Sophie plugged in her headphones, turned on the keyboard, and began her routine. Scales first to warm up her fingers. C major, then A minor, G major, E minor, working through the circle of fifths. The familiar patterns were soothing after the stress of the day. Her fingers moved automatically, muscle memory taking over. After scales came arpeggios, then a Bach prelude she'd been polishing for her audition. Bach required precision and clarity, each voice distinct yet contributing to the whole. Sophie lost herself in the interwoven melodies, her earlier humiliation fading as she concentrated on the music. When she finished the Bach, she took a deep breath and turned to her greatest challenge, Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was an ambitious choice for an audition piece, perhaps too ambitious. The ballade demanded not just technical skill but emotional depth, ranging from tender lyricism to thunderous drama. Sophie began the opening bars, the haunting G minor melody that seemed to pose a question that the rest of the piece would attempt to answer. As she played, she thought about her journey to this moment, the years of lessons with her grandmother, the promising start at the pre-college program at Juilliard, cut short when her parents died and money became tight, the community college music classes she'd managed to take while working part-time, the hours stolen from sleep to practice, and now, here she was at 24, a waitress with calloused hands and aching feet, still chasing a dream that seemed to recede further with each passing year. When she reached the coda, with its cascading notes and final dramatic chords, Sophie played with a ferocity that surprised even herself. Her fingers flew across the keys, channeling all her frustration and determination into the music. In her mind, she wasn't in a small apartment in Queens, but on a concert stage, proving to the world and to people like Blake Harrington that she was more than what they saw on the surface. The final chord rang out in her headphones, and Sophie sat still, hands hovering above the keys, breathing hard as if she'd been running. This was why she kept going. This feeling. This connection to something larger than herself. Her phone buzzed with a text breaking the spell. It was from Lily, a fellow waitress at Bellini's. "You okay? Heard about what happened with that tech, bro." What a jerk. Sophie texted back, "I'm fine." "Got tomorrow off, though," Lily replied almost immediately. "That's not fair. Want me to ask if I can split my shift with you?" "No, it's okay. I'll practice instead. Thanks, though." Their loss. "BTW, did you hear the piano guy called in sick for the weekend? Filuti is scrambling." Sophie stared at the message, an idea forming. Bellini's had a baby grand piano in the corner of the dining room, used for ambient music on weekend evenings. The regular pianist was an older man named Howard, who played inoffensive versions of jazz standards and pop songs. Sophie had never spoken to him much. He came in, played his sets, and left. But she'd sometimes lingered near the piano when she had a free moment, drawn to the music even when it was just background for people's conversations. "No, didn't hear," she texted back. "Who's filling in?" "No one yet. Veluti was asking if anyone knew a pianist. Thought of you but wasn't sure if you play that kind of music." Sophie hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone. She needed the money, and playing piano for a few hours would be less physically demanding than waiting tables. But could she do it? Her repertoire was mostly classical, not the easy listening jazz and pop that Howard played. "I could do it," she wrote back. "I know some jazz standards, and I can learn anything quickly. For real? I'll tell Veluti tomorrow. He'll be so relieved. It's for Fry and Sat night." "Wait," Sophie typed. "Will that table be there? The tech guy? Harrington? No idea." "Does it matter? You'll be at the piano, not waiting on him." Sophie thought about it. Even if Blake Harrington did come back, he probably wouldn't recognize her out of her server's uniform, sitting at the piano instead of carrying a water pitcher. And if he did, well, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would be satisfying for him to see the water girl in a different light. "You're right," she texted Lily. "It doesn't matter. Tell Veluti I can do it." The next morning, Sophie woke up earlier than usual despite having the day off. Her grandmother was still asleep, so she made breakfast quietly, oatmeal with a sliced banana and a little honey, and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She created a playlist of piano jazz standards and popular songs that might work for the restaurant gig, then found sheet music online for ones she didn't already know. Most were simpler than the classical pieces she usually played, though jazz had its own challenges with improvisation and rhythm. Sophie spent the morning practicing, using the headphones so as not to disturb her grandmother. By lunchtime, she had a decent repertoire of songs that would work for background music at the restaurant. By 7:30, she was fully in her element, moving between pieces with an easy flow, adjusting her volume and style to complement the room's energy. She played a mix of classical pieces, jazz standards, and tasteful arrangements of popular songs, all chosen to create a sophisticated backdrop for the dining experience. During her first break, Lily brought her a plate of bread and a small bowl of soup. "On the house," she whispered. "Veluti says you're doing great. Several people have commented on how nice the music is tonight." Sophie smiled, pleased but trying not to show too much excitement. "Thanks, the piano's wonderful to play. Better than carrying water pitchers, huh?" "Definitely better on the feet," Sophie agreed with a small laugh. As she ate, Sophie noticed increased activity at the front of the restaurant. A large group was being led to the back section that had been reserved for the private party. Her view was partially blocked, but she caught glimpses of men in expensive suits and women in cocktail dresses. Her stomach tightened at the thought of Blake Harrington being among them. When her break ended, Sophie returned to the piano with renewed determination. If he was here, if he did recognize her, she wanted him to hear her at her best. Not that she was playing for him. She was playing for herself, for her grandmother, for everyone who had ever believed in her talent. But there would be a certain satisfaction in showing Blake Harrington that the waitress he had humiliated was more than he had assumed. She began her second set with Gershwin's Rhapsody, in blue, simplified but still capturing the piece's blend of classical technique and jazz influences. Her fingers danced across the keys, bringing out the melody that seemed to embody the spirit of New York itself. Sophisticated, yet accessible. Complex, yet direct. As she played, Sophie became aware of the private party settling in. Through the shifting bodies of servers and guests, she occasionally caught sight of Blake Harrington at the head of the table, gesturing as he spoke to the group. He hadn't looked her way yet, his attention focused on his guests. Sophie continued playing, moving from Gershwin to Cole Porter, then to a gentle arrangement of a Beatles song. She kept her head down, focusing on the music while remaining acutely aware of the private party's presence. By 8:30, their dinner was in full swing. Mr. Veluti himself was overseeing their service, with Jason, the server who had replaced Sophie at their table during the water incident, attending to their every need. During a lull in her playing, as she was deciding what piece to transition to next, Sophie heard Blake Harrington's distinctive voice carry across the restaurant. "And the prototype is ready to demonstrate next week. This funding round will take us to the next level, gentlemen. Harrington Tech is positioned to revolutionize how data analytics functions in the financial sector." There was a murmur of approval from his guests. Sophie began to play again, choosing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major upper 9, number 2, one of the most beloved and recognizable classical pieces, its flowing melody perfect for creating a sophisticated atmosphere. As she played, she sensed a shift in attention from the private party. Someone had noticed the music. From the corner of her eye, she saw a woman in a burgundy dress lean over to say something to Blake, gesturing subtly toward the piano. Sophie kept her focus on the keys, putting more feeling into the Chopin, letting the melody sing above the harmonies. This was a piece she knew intimately, one she had played countless times for her grandmother, who loved its romantic sensibility. When she finished the nocturne, there was a brief pause in the restaurant's ambient noise, a moment of collective appreciation, before the conversations resumed. Sophie transitioned smoothly into another piece, but she was aware now that at least some of the private party were paying attention to her playing. Her second break came at 9 o'clock. As she stood and stepped away from the piano, Sophie glanced toward the private party. Blake was looking directly at her, a slight frown on his face as if trying to place her. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Sophie turned away, her heart beating faster. Had he recognized her? It had been dark in the restaurant when the water incident happened, and she looked different tonight. Hair down instead of pulled back, a dress instead of a uniform, makeup accentuating her features. Plus, she was in an entirely different context now. Lily intercepted her on the way to the staff room. "You're killing it. I've heard like 3 different tables talking about how good the piano is tonight." Sophie smiled, genuinely pleased. "Thanks. It's going better than I expected. Also, heads up, I heard Harrington asking Veluti about you." Sophie's smile faltered. "What did he say?" "Just asked who was playing. I don't think he recognized you. Veluti told him you're a new hire specifically for the piano, not a regular waitress." Lily rolled her eyes. "Typical. Veluti taking credit for discovering you when you've been here all along. Sophie wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed that Blake hadn't recognized her. Part of her wanted him to know, to make the connection between the incompetent waitress and the skilled pianist. When her break ended, Sophie returned to the piano with a new resolve. For her final set, she would play not just background music but pieces that showcased her true ability. Not to show off but to be authentic. To play the way she would if she were alone, or with only her grandmother listening. She began with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first movement, its haunting melody flowing from her fingers with emotional depth. As she played, the restaurant seemed to grow quieter, more diners turning their attention to the piano in the corner. From the private party, she sensed increased attention as well. Through the subtle shifts in posture and the occasional glance her way, Sophie could tell that at least some of them were actively listening now, not just hearing background music. As Sophie's fingers moved through the final notes of the Moonlight Sonata, she made a decision. For her last piece before closing, she would play Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, her audition piece, the most challenging work in her repertoire. It wasn't typical restaurant background music. It was a concert piece that told a story, with moments of tenderness that built to a passionate, technically demanding conclusion. But first, she would play a few more accessible pieces. She transitioned into a jazz arrangement of Summertime, then a medley of film themes that diners often recognized with pleased smiles. Through it all, she remained aware of the private party in the back section, especially of Blake Harrington, though she kept her eyes on the keys. At one point, as she finished a piece, she heard a burst of laughter from their table, followed by Blake's voice. Should have seen her face when I told her the offer was withdrawn. Priceless. Sophie tensed, reminded of his arrogance, his casual cruelty. She channeled that feeling into her next piece, a more forceful interpretation of a normally gentle song. Music had always been her way of expressing emotions too complex for words. By 9:40, the restaurant had thinned out somewhat, though Blake's party showed no signs of leaving. They had moved on to expensive cognacs and desserts, their voices growing louder as the night progressed. Mr. Veluti hovered nearby, ensuring their every whim was satisfied. Sophie began her final piece. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade rang out, deceptively simple like the beginning of a story told around a fire. She played the haunting melody with restraint, letting it unfold naturally. As the piece developed, becoming more complex, more emotional, Sophie forgot about Blake Harrington. She forgot about the restaurant, about the diners, about everything except the music flowing from her fingers. This wasn't background music anymore. This was Sophie Chen playing with her whole heart. The way she played when she was alone with her dreams. The ballad built in intensity, the harmonies growing richer, the technical challenges more demanding. Sophie's hands moved across the keyboard with confidence born from hundreds of hours of practice. When she reached the central melody, that heartbreaking tune that seemed to contain all the beauty and sadness of life, she played it with such emotion that her eyes closed briefly. When she opened them, she noticed that the restaurant had grown unusually quiet. Conversations had paused. Servers had stopped moving. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to have diminished. People were listening, really listening. As the piece moved toward its dramatic conclusion, with its cascading notes and thunderous chords, Sophie played with a power and precision that she usually reserved for her practice sessions. Her small frame seemed to grow larger at the piano, her hands drawing every possible color from the instrument. The final chords resonated through the restaurant, and in the moment of silence that followed, Sophie became aware of what she had done. She had forgotten herself, forgotten where she was, and played as if she were on a concert stage rather than providing dining ambiance. Then, to her surprise, applause broke out, first from a table near the piano, then spreading through the restaurant. Sophie looked up, startled to find many of the remaining diners watching her, some even standing. She smiled shyly and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. As the applause died down, Sophie gathered her sheet music, preparing to leave. It was 10 o'clock, the end of her scheduled time. She had played her heart out, and now she just wanted to go home and tell her grandmother how it had gone. "Excuse me." Sophie looked up to find a middle-aged woman standing beside the piano. She was elegantly dressed with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. That was extraordinary, the woman said. Particularly that last piece, Chopin's Ballad No. 1, wasn't it? Sophie nodded, surprised that the woman had recognized it. Yes, it was. I'm Diane Powell. I teach at the Manhattan School of Music. She handed Sophie a business card. We don't often find talent like yours playing in restaurants. Are you classically trained? Sophie's heart raced as she accepted the card. The Manhattan School of Music, the very institution she had been saving to apply to. Yes, she managed to say. I studied at Juilliard's pre-college program years ago, and I've been taking classes at community college. My grandmother was a piano teacher at a conservatory in Beijing. Diane nodded appreciatively. That explains a lot. Your technique is excellent, but it's your musicality that's truly special. Have you considered applying to music school? Actually, I've been planning to audition at Manhattan, Sophie admitted. I've been saving for the application fee. Well, consider this an informal pre-audition. I'd very much like to hear you play in a proper setting. Diane smiled. Call my office. We can arrange something. As Diane walked away, Sophie sat in stunned silence. Was this really happening? After years of struggle, of balancing work and practice and caring for her grandmother, had her talent finally been recognized? Her thoughts were interrupted by another voice, a male voice she recognized instantly. You're the waitress, aren't you? The one who spilled water all over me. Sophie looked up to find Blake Harrington standing beside the piano, a drink in his hand. Up close, she could see that his eyes were slightly glassy from alcohol, but his gaze was focused, studying her face. She straightened her back, meeting his eyes directly. Yes, I'm Sophie Chen. I knew I recognized you. He shook his head, a bemused expression on his face. I wouldn't have guessed you could play like that. The last piece especially. That wasn't restaurant music. No, Sophie agreed. It wasn't. Where did you learn to play like that? My grandmother taught me. She was a concert pianist before she developed Parkinson's. Blake took a sip of his drink, looking thoughtful. And now you're working as a waitress and playing piano on the side? I'm working as a waitress to support my grandmother and save for music school, Sophie corrected him. I'm filling in for the regular pianist who's sick. I see. Blake seemed to be processing this information, reconciling the woman before him with the server he had humiliated. You know, our company has an arts foundation. We sponsor musicians, among other things. Sophie felt a flash of irritation. Did he think he could dismiss his behavior with the offer of money? That she would be grateful for his patronage after the way he had treated her? I'm not looking for a sponsor, she said coolly. I'm working toward a scholarship based on merit. Blake raised his eyebrows, seeming both surprised and a little impressed by her response. Fair enough. But if you change your mind... He pulled out a business card and placed it on the piano. Talent should be supported. Before Sophie could respond, one of Blake's associates called him back to the table. He gave her a nod and walked away, leaving his card on the edge of the piano. Sophie stared at it for a moment, then tucked it into her bag along with Diane Powell's card. She wasn't sure what to make of the interaction. There had been no apology for his previous behavior, but there had been a recognition of her ability, and perhaps a dawning awareness of how wrong his assumptions about her had been. As she gathered her things to leave, Mr. Veluti approached, beaming. Sophie, why didn't you tell me you could play like that? The customers loved it. I had 3 different people ask me if you're playing tomorrow night. Yes, that was our agreement. I'm covering for Howard tomorrow as well. No, I mean regularly. Would you consider playing 1 or 2 nights a week even after Howard returns? We could work it around your serving schedule. Sophie hesitated. The extra money would be welcome, and playing piano was certainly easier on her body than carrying trays. But her real goal was music school, not being a restaurant pianist. I'll think about it, she promised. Right now I need to get home to my grandmother. Of course. We'll talk tomorrow. Mr. Veluti patted her shoulder. You were a sensation tonight. A real sensation. Outside the restaurant, the night air was cool against Sophie's skin. The city hummed around her, taxis honking, late-night pedestrians hurrying past, the distant wail of a siren. She took a deep breath, still processing everything that had happened. 2 business cards sat in her bag, one from a professor at her dream school, one from the man who had humiliated her days earlier. Both represented possible futures, possible paths forward. But neither was as important as the jade pendant around her neck, her grandmother's gift. a reminder of where she came from and who had believed in her from the beginning. Sophie headed for the subway, eager to get home and share the events of the evening with her grandmother. As she descended the steps into the station, her phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "You were amazing. Everyone's talking about it. See you tomorrow." Sophie smiled and texted back, "Thanks. Yes, playing again tomorrow. Might have some news to share." On the train ride home, Sophie found herself mentally practicing the ballade again, analyzing her performance, noting the places where she could have played with more control or more expression. Even after her success tonight, she wasn't satisfied. That was the nature of music, of art. There was always room to grow, to improve, to dig deeper. By the time she reached her stop in Queens, it was after 11. The streets were quieter here than in Manhattan, though still busy with late-night food vendors and people returning from evening shifts. Sophie walked the familiar blocks to their apartment building, her mind still spinning with the events of the evening. The apartment was dark when she entered, but a small lamp had been left on in the living room. Her grandmother had tried to wait up but had fallen asleep in her armchair, a book open on her lap. Sophie gently touched her shoulder. "Night-night, I'm home." Lynn stirred and opened her eyes, smiling when she saw Sophie. "Ah, you're back. How was it? Did you play well?" Sophie sat on the footstool in front of her grandmother's chair, taking the older woman's trembling hands in hers. "It was amazing. People actually listened. They applauded after my last piece." Of course they did. "You play beautifully." Lynn squeezed her hands. "Tell me everything." So Sophie did, describing the restaurant, the piano, the feeling of playing for an audience again after so long. She told her about Diane Powell from the Manhattan School of Music, showing her grandmother the business card with excitement. "She said she wants to hear me play in a proper setting. She called it an informal pre-audition." Lynn beamed with pride. "You see? I told you someone always listens. The right person at the right time." Sophie hesitated, then added, "Blake Harrington was there, the rude customer from before. He recognized me." Lynn's expression darkened. "What did he say? Was he rude again?" "No, actually he seemed surprised. He offered me his business card. Said his company has an arts foundation that sponsors musicians." "And what did you say?" Sophie smiled. "I told him I wasn't looking for a sponsor, that I was working toward a scholarship based on merit." Lynn laughed softly, her eyes twinkling. "That's my Sophie, proud and stubborn, just like your mother." They talked a while longer, Lynn asking detailed questions about the piano's quality and which pieces had received the best reception. Even with her hands too unsteady to play anymore, Lynn's mind was still sharp when it came to music, still passionate about the art form that had defined her life. Finally, Sophie helped her grandmother to bed, making sure she took her evening medication and had water within reach on her nightstand. Then she went to her own small bedroom and changed out of her dress, hanging it carefully in the closet. Before getting into bed, Sophie sat at her keyboard, put on her headphones, and played through the sections of the ballade that she felt could be improved. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because the music was part of her now, flowing through her veins alongside her blood. Tomorrow she would play at the restaurant again. Tomorrow she would call Diane Powell's office. Tomorrow she would take another step toward the future she had been working for. But tonight, as she finally laid her head on the pillow, Sophie allowed herself to savor the moment when the restaurant had fallen silent, when the Chopin had flowed from her fingers like liquid emotion, when she had forgotten herself completely in the act of creation. That, she knew, was why she played. Not for applause or recognition or even for financial support, though all those things were welcome. She played because when she was at the piano she became more fully herself than at any other time. Everything else, the restaurant, the rude customers, the financial struggles, fell away, leaving only Sophie and the music, inseparable and complete. 6 months later, Sophie stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, her heart pounding in her chest. She smoothed down the front of her simple black concert dress and touched the jade pendant at her neck for reassurance. How had so much changed so quickly? Sometimes she still couldn't believe the path her life had taken since that night at Bellini's. The day after her first piano performance at the restaurant, Sophie had called Diane Powell's office, half expecting to reach a secretary who would politely take a message that would never be returned. Instead, Diane herself had answered, warmly inviting Sophie to play for her at the Manhattan School of Music the following week. "Bring your audition pieces," Diane had said. I'd like to hear the full range of what you can do." That audition had gone well, so well that Diane had immediately introduced Sophie to the department chair and arranged for a formal application. The application fee had been waived, an unusual step that Diane had insisted upon after hearing Sophie's story. "Talent like yours shouldn't be held back by finances," she'd said firmly. 2 weeks later, Sophie had received the acceptance letter, along with news of a partial scholarship. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but combined with her savings and some additional work, it made attending possible. The most difficult conversation had been with her grandmother about care arrangements. "You can't give up school to take care of me," Lynn had insisted when Sophie expressed concern about balancing her studies with her grandmother's needs. "We will find a way." And they had. Mrs. Liu from next door continued to help during the day. Sophie arranged her classes to be home in the evenings. And then, unexpectedly, another solution had presented itself. Blake Harrington had returned to Bellini's the night after Sophie's first performance. He had watched her play for nearly 2 hours, occasionally making notes on his phone. When she finished, he had approached the piano again. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," he'd said without preamble. "You said you weren't looking for a sponsor, but for a scholarship based on merit. I respect that." Sophie had simply nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "Our foundation typically sponsors artists in various ways, funding, performances, commissions, that sort of thing. But we also have a community outreach program." He'd slid a folder across the piano to her. Inside was information about the Harrington Tech Arts Foundation's Elder Care Initiative, a program that provided in-home care assistance to family members of promising artists. "It's not charity," Blake had said, seeming to read her expression. "It's an investment in cultural development." "Your grandmother was a music teacher, you said? If you're accepted to a music program, she would qualify for our assistance." Sophie had been speechless, torn between pride and practicality. Blake Harrington was still the arrogant man who had humiliated her. But this wasn't a handout. It was a structured program that could genuinely help her grandmother while Sophie pursued her education. "Why?" she'd finally asked. "Why offer this to me?" Blake had looked uncomfortable, running a finger along the edge of the piano. "Let's just say I'm trying to recognize my miscalculations. I judged you based on one moment, one interaction. I was wrong." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. In the end, Sophie had accepted the foundation's assistance, and it had made all the difference. Her grandmother now had a trained aide who came daily while Sophie attended classes. Lynn's Parkinson's was being managed with better medical care than they'd been able to afford previously. And now, here was Sophie, about to perform at Carnegie Hall as part of the Young Artists Showcase, a prestigious concert featuring the most promising students from New York's top music schools. 5 minutes, Ms. Chen, a stage manager said, peeking into the small waiting area. Sophie nodded, trying to calm her breathing. She would be playing the Chopin Ballade again, the piece that had changed everything that night at Bellini's. She had performed it dozens of times in practice rooms and recitals over the past months, refining her interpretation, deepening her understanding of the music. But playing it here on this legendary stage was something else entirely. A small knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mr. Velluti, looking uncomfortable in a suit instead of his usual restaurant attire. "Sophie, just wanted to wish you luck." He handed her a small bouquet of flowers. "Everyone at Bellini's is rooting for you. We've got your picture up by the entrance now, you know. Our pianist who went on to Carnegie Hall. Great for business?" Sophie smiled, genuinely touched by his gesture despite his obvious pride in the connection. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Velluti. And thank you for giving me that chance to play when Howard got sick." "Ah, well," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I should have known you had talent. You were always so, what's the word, precise, even as a waitress." Sophie laughed. Mr. Velluti had never quite apologized for siding with Blake Harrington during the water incident, but he had made amends in his own way, continuing to let her play at the restaurant on weekends even after Howard returned, giving her a more flexible schedule when she started classes. "Is Lily coming?" she asked, referring to her former co-worker who had become a good friend. "Already in her seat with her boyfriend, and half the waitstaff took the night off to be here. You're a celebrity to us now, you know." After Mr. Velluti left, Sophie's piano professor, Diane Powell, came in to check on her. "Remember, you're ready for this," Diane said, clasping Sophie's hands in her own. "Just play the way you did that night I first heard you, like you're telling a story only you know." Sophie nodded gratefully. "I'll try." "Your grandmother is in the front row as requested," Diane added with a smile. "She looks very proud." The thought of her grandmother watching her play at Carnegie Hall brought tears to Sophie's eyes. Lynn had been there for every step of her musical journey, from her first halting notes as a child to this moment. Despite her Parkinson's, despite all the challenges, she had never stopped believing in Sophie's talent. 2 minutes. "Miss Chen," the stage manager called. As Diane left, one more visitor slipped into the waiting area, Blake Harrington. He looked different from the arrogant businessman who had mocked Sophie at Bellini's, more subdued, more thoughtful. "I just wanted to say good luck," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "The foundation is proud to support your grandmother's care." "Thank you," Sophie said simply. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect born from the recognition of error on his part and resilience on hers. "You know," Blake said, "I've been thinking about that night at Bellini's when you spilled the water. I was in the middle of a major deal that was falling apart. I was stressed, angry at the world. You were just an easy target." Sophie looked at him steadily. "That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. I should have said this months ago. I'm sorry." "Truly sorry." Sophie nodded, accepting his apology at last. "We all have moments we're not proud of, Mr. Harrington. It's what we do afterward that matters." "Ms. Chen?" "It's time," the stage manager called. Blake stepped back. "Break a leg out there." Sophie took one last deep breath and walked toward the stage. As she stepped into the spotlight, the audience before her was a blur of faces, but she could make out her grandmother in the front row, beside Diane Powell. Lily and the other servers from Bellini's were a few rows back. Mr. Velluti sat proudly nearby. And somewhere in the back, she knew, was Blake Harrington. But as she sat at the gleaming concert grand piano, larger and more beautiful than anything she'd played before, Sophie thought not of the audience, but of the music. Of the story she was about to tell through Chopin's notes. Of the journey that had brought her here. The hall fell silent, hundreds of people waiting for her to begin. Sophie placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. She thought of her grandmother's hands guiding hers when she was small, of the hours spent practicing on their old upright piano in Beijing, of her parents' pride when she played her first recital, of the years of struggle and sacrifice after they died, of her keyboard in Queens with its headphones for late-night practice. And then she began to play. The opening notes of the ballade filled Carnegie Hall, simple yet profound, like the beginning of a great story. As Sophie played, she poured everything into the music, her struggles, her dreams, her losses, her victories. The piece built and flowed, tender in places, thunderous in others, just like life itself. When she reached the central melody, that heart-rending tune that had first caught the audience's attention at Bellini's, Sophie played with even greater emotional depth than before. Now she understood not just the notes, but their meaning. The way music could transform pain into beauty, struggle into art. The final section of the piece, with its technical challenges and dramatic conclusion, passed under Sophie's fingers with a confidence she could never have imagined 6 months earlier. When she struck the final chords, letting them resonate through the hall, there was a moment of complete silence, as if the audience needed to catch its collective breath. Then applause erupted, people rising to their feet. Sophie stood and bowed, her eyes finding her grandmother in the front row. Lynn was crying, her hands trembling not just from Parkinson's but from emotion as she applauded her granddaughter. As Sophie took a second bow, she thought of the moment in Bellini's when Blake Harrington had sneered at her, suggesting she'd never amount to anything beyond carrying plates. She thought of all the assumptions people make about others based on what they can see on the surface. A waitress, an immigrant, a young woman struggling to make ends meet. They couldn't see her hours of practice, her years of study, her determination to honor her grandmother's legacy. They couldn't see the music that lived inside her, waiting for the right moment to be heard. That night at Bellini's, the music had finally spoken. And now, on this stage, it sang more clearly than ever. As Sophie left the stage to continued applause, she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more hard work, more moments of doubt. A single performance at Carnegie Hall didn't guarantee a career. The path of an artist was never easy or certain, but she had proven something to herself and to the world, that Sophie Chen was more than what anyone might assume at first glance. That talent and determination could overcome obstacles. That sometimes the most extraordinary music comes from the most unexpected places, and that was worth everything. Worth the struggles, worth the humiliation, worth the years of waiting for her chance. Worth it all, for this moment of pure joy, when the music that had always lived in her heart finally found its way into the world.